Good evening and welcome to the Dusty Feet. It's another Thursday night. You can tell by the border that it's a red string night, and that's always cool. So, wait, there we go. Oh, my push button's slightly different spot, and I was like, weirded myself out. So, as you look up the series that we have, this is a red string series. It's there. Each of the series that we have is at the Dusty Feet, so you can check. Even my non-series item with Heather is actually in what's called the non-series item for the things that aren't tied up. That might eventually become a series, but at this point it's still a non-series. Updates are on Twitter, so go there for those kind of pieces. And as you can tell there, it's a red string, and our guest is Jim Wern. And I'm excited as always to have my brother on this because he brings so much out. And I love having him on. So we're going to talk about some stuff, and we're actually going to we're going to play an AlephBeta video and then talk about it because there's some great application and thought process that goes through there. But as always on the Dusty Feet, this is a place where we can safely explore the endless ways of God, interconnection of His creation, where belief understandings may be challenged, divine misunderstandings may exist, and traditional teachings might falter as we pursue connection, context, and community with God and each other here in an environment of grace and love. So here we go on Follow the Red String. And there he is.
Ta-da!
Ta-da. And again, just in case you confuse us, Yeah. So, yeah.
Make sure we call the right person.
That's it, right? That person, so I know who it is. We get it that way. Although, I had a friend of mine that has started to embrace the given name that he has. And that's another story. And I hope to have him on, actually, to talk about that. It's neat because it goes with the whole thing about acceptance in his past and all kinds of things. It's a really neat story with that. But so because I'm Robert and he's James, but we're Bob and Jim, or Bobby and Jimmy to
depending on who you're talking to.
To our aunts, right? We're Bobby and Jimmy. Just so you know, it depends on the crowd.
And at work, I'm called everything from Jim to James to Jimothy to Jimbo to Jimmy. So I get a little bit of everything.
There you go.
And interesting, when you're talking about your friend, embracing the given name. I had a friend who really heard from God that he was given a new name. And that's a whole nother discussion.
It's a whole nother,
That's pretty powerful, very biblical in context. And we were actually part of the process of listening on behalf of him to God, for his name. And it was really powerful, but we'll have that discussion some other time.
Yeah. That name could be a whole nother, but there you go. See, we got another red string discussion, and calls that up, and maybe part of the other series. So we need to work on that too. So tonight you're going to listen to an AlephBeta video. It's Parsha Balak for those that are doing the Parsha study pieces. But theirs on this cover was how to be honest with ourselves. Okay, so let's take a listen. Obviously, they're going to get in like they do the Hebrew repetition, what draws the stories together and that kind of stuff. And then listen to Rivki's heart as she shares at the end, as she ties this all together. And I think it has something to show for us. So let's enjoy this.
Hi, I'm Rivki Stern, and you're watching AlephBeta. This is Parshat Balak. Let me ask you a question. You're a rational person, right? When you make decisions about your opinions, I'm sure you rely on evidence and data to arrive at those beliefs. And if someone showed you evidence to the contrary, that you were looking at false data or reading fake news, you'd backtrack, right? I think we'd all like to think this about ourselves, but I'm not so sure it's true. Are we really being honest with ourselves when we say, I see the world with clear eyes? With all of the talk about fake news and alternative facts, this question has become surprisingly relevant and important in our day and age. And wouldn't you know it, I actually think that the story of Balak, the king of Moab, deals with this question head on and gives us a deep insight about how we reckon with reality. So let's take a look at the story of Balak together. We'll start with some context. We're now in year 40 of Israel's wanderings through the wilderness. They're finally almost at the promised land, and they've just won stunning military victories against two mighty kings, Sichon and Og. And here's where Balak, the king of Moab, comes in. I want to read the verses about how Balak responded to these victories. But even if you've read this story before, pretend that you're reading it for the first time. I think you'll begin to notice some surprising things. Okay, let's begin. Vayar Balak ben Zippor. And Balak, the son of Zippor, saw et kol asher asa Yisrael la'emori, everything that was done by Israel to the Amorites. Et kol asher asa, everything that was done. On their own, those are really common words. But when was the last time that we encountered these particular 4 words in this particular order? I'll give you a hint. These words were said in a remarkably similar circumstance. A different non-Israelite leader heard about a different Israelite victory over a different foreign nation. And like Balak, that other leader also gets a whole parsha named after him. Did you guess it? I'm thinking of Yitro. The Torah told us, Vayishma Yitro Kohen Midyan Choten Moshe. And Yitro, the priest of Midian and the father-in-law of Moses, heard, Et kol asher asa Elokim Moshe l'Yisrael amo, everything that God did for Moses and for his nation Israel. Ki yotzi Hashem et Yisrael miMitzrayim, when God took Israel out of Egypt. When Israel experienced a major triumph over Egypt, Yitro had noticed. And in the last 40 years, Israel's just been quietly wandering through the desert. But now, they're making headlines again, winning those wars against Sichon and Og. And Balak takes notice. And the exact same phrase is used to describe their reactions, et kol asher asa, everything that was done. And there's even more that these two characters share in common. Look at Balak's name, Balak ben Zippor, the son of Zippor, a bird. There's only one other person in the entire Torah with the Zippor name. And you know who it is? Yitro's daughter, the wife of Moses, Zipporah. What are the odds? And if that's not enough, both Balak and Yitro have strong connections to the nation of Midian. Yitro is the high priest of Midian. And right after Balak hears about the Israelites' victory, he turns straight to Midian to try to broker an alliance. Rashi even says that Balak himself was actually a Midianite prince before he was appointed king of Moab. So let's recap what we found. We have a non-Israelite leader who notices, holy cow, Israel just completely destroyed these really strong nations. Et kol asher asa, Zippor, and Midian. It really does feel like the Torah is trying to hint to us. This guy, Balak, he's echoing this other guy, Yitro, from many chapters and many years ago. It almost seems like the Torah is preparing us to hear another Yitro story. But not so fast. Let's read on in the story and see how Balak then responds to what he hears. Vayagar Moab mipnei ha'am me'od. And Moab becomes incredibly scared of this nation. Ki ravhu, because they're so numerous. Vayakatz Moab mipnei bnei Yisrael. And Moab was overcome with dread because of the children of Israel. Balak's people are terrified. The Israelites are so numerous that they pose an existential threat. And in his fear, Balak turns to Bilam, a local prophet, and he asks for help. He tells him, Hine am yatsa miMitzrayim. Here's this people, the ones who left Egypt, and they also just won these wars, and there are so many of them. I need help, Bilam. Va'ata lechana ar'ali et ha'am hazeh. Please go and curse that nation for me. Ki atzum hu mimeni, because they're so much stronger than me. Now, before, we noticed all these parallels between Balak and Yitro. But let me ask you something. Does this sound like Yitro? Not really. Yitro was overjoyed by the news of the Israelites' victory over Egypt. So much so that he ran out to celebrate with his son-in-law. But Balak is terrified by the Israelites' success, and he wants to stop them before they can take over. And it's not just that Balak sounds particularly un-Yitro-like here. His reaction actually sounds a whole lot like someone else, like another foreign king who had similar fears. It kind of reminds us of Pharaoh, way back in the very beginning of the Egypt story, before the Israelites became Egypt's slaves. The Israelites had experienced a population boom, and Pharaoh was terrified. He said, "Hinei am b'nei Israel rav v'yatzum mimenu." This nation of Israel is greater and mightier than us. And look at those words he uses, rav, atzum mimenu. It's the same language we find with Balak. And the connections don't stop there. Look at the Egyptian people's response to the Israelites. Vayakutsu mipnei b'nei Israel. They were overcome with dread because of the children of Israel. That's a really specific way to describe their reaction. And it's the very same reaction we find with the people of Moab. Vayakatz Moab mipnei b'nei Israel. And Moab was overcome with dread because of the children of Israel. And both Pharaoh and Balak decide to act on their fears. Pharaoh enslaves the Israelites, and Balak, he runs to hire Bilam to curse them. Each of these two kings attempted to stop Israel from overpowering them. But that leaves me a little confused. At first, it seemed like the Torah was comparing Balak to Yitro. But then we get hit with these Pharaoh parallels. Why would that be? Why would we have comparisons pulling us in two different directions, one right after the other? I think that in order to understand why both of these parallels are showing up here, we need to understand who Yitro and Pharaoh really are. What does each of them represent? And how can they shed light on the character of Balak? So who was Yitro? Yitro was a Midianite priest. But when he saw Israel's strength and their triumph over Egypt, he said, "How incredible! I need to go celebrate with them." And Pharaoh? Pharaoh also witnessed a flourishing Israel, but he reacted in the opposite way. He didn't celebrate their success. He didn't try to ally with Israel. He felt threatened by them, and he tried to crush them. Why do they react so differently? Well, maybe you could say it's because Pharaoh has more skin in the game. After all, the Israelites are in his kingdom, so he feels threatened. But I think there's actually something deeper going on. Perhaps they're reacting differently because they're actually seeing Israel's success through two different lenses. Yitro saw the signs and wonders of the Exodus, the 10 plagues, the splitting of the sea. He looked at those events unfolding before him, and it was clear to him that God, the all-powerful creator, was helping Israel succeed. But Pharaoh didn't see any of this. He didn't see God's involvement with Israel. When Pharaoh became afraid of the Israelites, it happened way before the plagues, before Moses and Aaron were even born. As far as he was concerned, he was dealing with a foreign tribe that was growing in strength and numbers. God wasn't even on his radar. So we've got these two models here. Yitro is the model of how a leader reacts to an ascendant Israel when it's clear that God is on their side. And Pharaoh is the model of how a leader might react when Israel is on the rise, but he doesn't know that they're God's chosen people. So let's come back to Balak. Balak is parallel to Yitro, he's parallel to Pharaoh, and maybe now we can understand why. Maybe the Torah is setting up Yitro and Pharaoh as two possible models for how Balak might react when he sees Israel once again on the rise. Will Balak respond like Yitro or like Pharaoh? It would seem to come down to one thing. Does Balak know that God is involved here? Well, Balak does know about the Exodus. He calls the Israelites Am Yatzah Mitzrayim, the people who left Egypt. But look carefully at those words. The people who left Egypt? As if one day they just decided to get up and walk out of there. Balak conveniently leaves God out of the story. There weren't plagues. There wasn't an Exodus. Just the people who left on their own volition. It's like he's rewriting history. And when he sees Israel miraculously winning battles against Sichon and Og, Balak tells himself a similar story. Vayar Balak et kol asher asa Yisrael le'emori. He saw with the people what Israel did to the Amorites. Once again, Balak is completely ignoring God's role here. Contrast this now with Yitro, who heard et kol asher asa Elokim, everything that God did. Ki yotzi Hashem et Yisrael miMitzrayim, that God took them out of Egypt. God smote the Egyptians. Yitro saw what was happening with perfect clarity, how God's hand was behind Israel's success. The Torah seems to set up Balak's story as a potential replay of the Yitro story. Balak sees Israel's success and he has the opportunity to recognize God's hand at work. But he doesn't. Instead, Balak acts like Pharaoh, responding to Israel with fear and aggression. But Balak doesn't have Pharaoh's excuse. The exodus from Egypt, with its wonders and miracles, already happened. It's well-established history. Balak has had 40 years to recognize the obvious truth, that God is behind all of Israel's success, but he refuses to let himself admit it. He's in denial, and so he tries in vain to curse Israel. What are we supposed to learn from this portrait of Balak in denial? Was Balak just a lone psychopath who acted in a totally irrational way? Or is the Torah pointing us to something else, something that's relevant to all of us? We all like to think that we see things for what they are, that we make rational assessments of reality and then make decisions based on this clear and sound perception. But the story of Balak should make us wonder, are we so sure that we see things for what they are? If we dig a bit deeper, don't we also tend to look at things as we want them to be? I was recently listening to a podcast called Freakonomics, where a professor of neuroscience, Robert Sapolsky, was explaining how difficult it is for people to change their minds. Dr. Sapolsky was saying that, although we want to think that we use facts to make decisions, we actually tend to make decisions based on our emotions. And we use select facts to then confirm the opinions that we've already formed. But we ignore or conveniently cast aside all of those other facts that contradict our conclusions. We've got these biases built into our brains, and we twist the facts and evidence in front of us to make them fit the way we want things to be. So it's no wonder that when we get into debates about political issues, we rarely actually listen to what the other person is saying to us. Instead, we're just thinking about all of the talking points that we can throw their way, convincing ourselves more and more of the way we see the world. In other words, there's probably a little more Balak inside all of us than we care to admit. So is that it? Are we just doomed to live in our own echo chambers? Is there any way to get out of the trap of our own biases, our own preconceived notions? A lot of the time, honestly, I feel like we have no hope of breaking loose. I scan through Twitter, Facebook, I just see everyone talking past one another, voicing those opinions that they think are rational, they think are based on facts and evidence. But to me, it just looks like Balak's fallacy. And then there are those moments where I see it in myself, and that scares me even more. But there are other times where I feel more optimistic, and I wonder if there might be some way through. The podcast does offer some tips. They say, switch places and try to argue the other side. Just as an exercise, try it for 5 minutes. Or, seek out an intelligent person who disagrees with you and try to really listen to their perspective. I'll be honest, this is a struggle for me. It's hard to remind myself that just because I think I'm right about something, that doesn't mean I am. It's hard to honestly ask myself, what are my biases? What's my emotional attachment to my very strong opinions? What's the truth that's staring me in the face that I just can't see? Between you and me, I'm somewhat skeptical about my prospects for success. But one thing that I'm sure of is that I have a responsibility to try. Thanks for watching. We didn't get into any of Bilam's actual prophecies in this video, but one of my favorite Balak videos on AlephBeta does just that. It's from David Block. Watch that video by clicking on the link in the description. Shabbat Shalom.
So, yeah. By the way, the links to this video are in the description. So please, you can check it out and then check out that other video too, because Jim and I were just talking about it. That was one of the things that we don't talk about is Balak's. This is in this particular setup. Not only is he doing this, but then he tries to get a prophet of God to curse God's people. Right? This is, and we'll argue that that Balaam is a non-Jew prophet. Okay.
Right.
More on the Melchizedekian thought process, right? So then he gets him to curse a chosen people of God from a God's deal, and it backfires dramatically. So those links are in the description. So Rivki lays out a bit here, and drawing from that picture in Scripture, and then she lays a bit out of herself and says, "This is hard to." To not only be responsible for the information that how we process and then how we share it, right, and how we take it and are aware of that, but then our ability to change if wherever we think we are in that knowledge. So what hit you here?
Well, one of the things, it's been very fresh on my mind listening to her when she was talking about, what are my unconscious biases, that I'm not even aware of. And right now in the corporate environment, that's a huge thing. And there's a lot going on with, even our company, we have to sit down and watch videos, hours of videos, dealing with unconscious bias, and, how we treat other associates. And at first it's like, just another corporate stuff you have to sit through. But as I listen to them and as they're talking, we don't realize there's a lot of unconscious bias that goes on. Mm-hmm. You and I were just talking off camera about, this Clubhouse group that we're a part of. And in there, we've got...
What's the name of the Clubhouse group?
It's called the House Church.
So anybody that's listening that is on Clubhouse, it's called the House Church. And if you want to talk about Clubhouse, make a comment, leave in the description, blah, 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 whatever.
Absolutely.
And we'll talk about it. But go on. Yeah, the House Church.
So with this unconscious bias, you and I were talking about the fact that we grew up Republican Christian. And I always thought Democrats can't be Christians because they just don't have, they don't have the same perspective. And then I'm now friends with a number of Christians who are Democrats who can't believe that there are Christians who are Republicans, because there's just no way that you could be a Republican and still adhere to, what God says. And we realized that we have these biases that were already ingrained in us, that as we sit down at the table, we realize we have a lot more in common than we disagree on. And the things that we disagree on really are not essentials to, God's economy.
Right.
But
and you bring up a good point there, because the disagreements were, we'll argue, political in nature, meaning how you expected something to be done, and it was, versus the scriptural support that was underneath it. So I'm agreeing with you, and that was one of those interesting things. Again, being in this Clubhouse and hearing this. So go on, that was good.
Well, and we're the way things have been going, a lot because of the pandemic. So much focus now to online, obviously for work situations, but then also for your information about what's going on, and you realize you're reading so much stuff out there, and how do you know what's true and what's not? People claiming to be, I was driving home listening to the radio, and they were saying, a recent study said this, and it's like, okay, who did the study? How extensive was it? Has it been verified? And so we take all this information in without doing the due diligence to find out whether it is, legit or not. Wikipedia has replaced Britannica, and yet Wikipedia over and over again has been proven to be very inaccurate, but we assume it to be true because, hey, it's on the internet. It must be true. And
The
we've
wiki
lost,
says, right.
yeah, exactly. We've lost the scholarly respect
That's a good
that
word. Yeah.
that information. We just think because somebody said it, it must be true.
Right.
And even here with Balak, he was coming from this assumption that there was no God. That really is the heart of his assumption. And so he's acting in a way, said, the Israelite people did this, versus the other story where it was, God did this. And that's going to automatically change the way that you approach a circumstance. And that's what happens with us. We end up, moving in a direction thinking we know that this is the right way to go without really listening to or looking at the truth.
Yeah. They Rifke makes the point that when that you're engaging in discussion where you're intentionally talking about things that are going to bring out these elements, that you're focused on your answer, not on hearing what they have to say in this. And trust me, that's pot calling kettle black. So make no bones. This hand's up, Jack. Just so you know, that has been. If Paul has that thing, he says, is it this thorn in his side that he has with that? That's one of my thorns, bar none. And I have to constantly step back and say, listen, what's happening. Again, why I like the Clubhouse group is just part of that. Was sit back and listen to what's to be said. RJ threw me for a loop. Speaking of which, he threw me a curveball that I wasn't expecting to come from RJ, and yet it was brilliant and well said and well articulated. Part of that, and you said it, is that the information that we get and our due diligence sharing. When you and I did reports, I know at LAB, you had sports, and then you had to document, just like you had footnotes.
Yep.
You wrote the footnotes and the page and the reference and where you got your info from and what you had and then if you didn't have it right, the teacher would call you out. In other words, they'd say, this is not true, because they go back and will check your stuff, and your ibids better match your initial lines. Ibid, 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 ibid. And trust me, people, if you don't know what that is, go back and do some scholarly learning, because I think it's important. I do in that capacity. But when we take knowledge and we run with it, you and I were talking again earlier before, and this is the question that I have to toss out is, how is our integrity because we're two entities. We are our individualness, right? And then because we claim to be of the body of Messiah, right? We have a community that we're attached to. Okay? So we represent that community. Yeshua calls us emissaries. Jesus said that's what we are. Okay? So do you think that the question, this might be rhetorical, do you think that what you do every day has just as much of an impact as what you talk about when you talk about a Bible word?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And I think that is, when you look at the way Jesus approached teaching, he was very much, it was dialogue, it was educational. Oftentimes he responded to questions with questions, because he wanted to know their perspective. I mean, obviously, as God, there's a fine line there between, in terms of his deity, what he set aside. He could not read someone's mind, but he was dependent upon the Spirit to give him truth.
Right, but in that, he wants to know what they're thinking. I hear what you're saying. That's a good balance point to go over, but he's doing it to hear them speak.
Right.
Yeah.
and to give them an opportunity to verbalize what's going on inside,
Right.
which sometimes ends up being the very trap that they get stuck in.
Right. Right.
But he was a listener, and we don't listen well. We want to, give our statement, and it's so easy today, especially with things like Twitter, is I can blab a thing out and have no responsibility for what kind of impact it has.
Yeah.
And we don't realize that and what it can do to a person.
Right.
And so, we have to be people who, it's very common, phrase where they say God gave us 2 ears and 1 mouth. We should listen twice as much as we speak. It's harder than it seems. And it is definitely a practice that needs to be exercised more.
Yeah. We have ideas, and we want to throw them out, and we want to share, and that's good. I think that the dialogue interaction is part and parcel. I think that our need to say quantify the is why we believe what we believe, why we think what we think, those kind of deals is a fair statement. And how we do that is I have a note which is going to read this way. It's R2 versus how to. In other words, we are to do a lot of things, right? And meaning and that's a good thing, like we are to share, we are to talk about it. Mm-hmm. The how to is what I believe that's what Jesus talked about. Yeah. When he was at his points, he would say, you've heard this. That's the R2. Then he'd go, let's get to the how to.
Yeah.
Let's talk. And then because you're in an agricultural economy, we're going to use stories that are agriculturally based. Mm-hmm. The majority of you work for a boss. So we're going to talk about things about slaves and masters. And in that term, slaves are not necessarily, we'd call them employees today. The biblical terminology is not the guy getting cracked on. It's the guy that works for somebody else, hence the gets into the fair day's wage, fair day's labor, that kind of thinking. But how we share what we share and what we share and how we share it. Mm-hmm. And then I had this, the ripple effect. And the joke today on the internet, right? Once it's out there, you can't take it back.
Yep.
Right? Now you get it. Once it's out there, you can't take it back.
Yeah.
Okay. I personally believe it has been that way from the garden. Once it's out there, you can't take it back. And it has a ripple effect that is like the ripple effect is really the butterfly effect.
Yeah.
You don't get that a butterfly beating its wings in the Amazon causes a hurricane somewhere else or has a direct impact that follow the red string that will get you there. And the impact that we have when we say something and when we share stuff that we either one shouldn't share or haven't checked, and then we turn around and we spew it out, and then heaven forbid we should say my bad that we got it wrong, because we just don't do that. Unfortunately, that's the bane of that. You don't go on and you tweeted something wrong. You don't come back and tweet, oh my gosh, how bad, at least the same audience that got the original tweet. Okay? But like I said, it's already gone. Somebody took it and shared it that doesn't follow it, right? So something that you shared or said, do we understand that setup? I'll go back to the first chapters of Genesis when Cain slays Abel, and God says the blood in the earth screams back. Okay, it calls to me, and it's not blood, it's bloods. It's plural in Hebrew for a reason, because the rabbis say the annotation is that everything that's supposed to come from Abel through eternity ceased to be. Okay? So that same principle flips. If it's out there and alive until it dies, it will continue to be. And where it goes, we are still living the effects today of, in our age. Hitler, Hiroshima, and those are big newses in our days. The Crusades, the pogroms, name stuff through history that hasn't. What's scary is when you go back and figure out, where did Genghis Khan affect you? And then you go back and to go and study where Genghis Khan affected you. You go, well, that's another story from somewhere else that didn't do it. And I go, I think you'll find out that you have a different deal. So then you think, well, what I say isn't important enough. I disagree. And I think if we took the time to stop and realize what we said could do that. If I could take back all the things that I taught my girls, and now I realize I shouldn't have taught them, or didn't do it well enough, or was wrong, if I could take them all back, I could. I can't.
Yeah.
Are there repercussions from those? In the vernacular, gare dang tee it, and to a detriment that's not good. So we walk through and live on, and that's what grace is for, right?
Exactly. And I think we talk a lot about redemption, and God can redeem those. And I think Paul had in mind when he said, all things work together for good for those who love God. He didn't say everything always is great. He didn't say, those things don't get, erased that we've done. But God has a way of utilizing even the mistakes, even the wrong things said, as long as we continue to follow the process of wanting to be people who change and who want to become better. Yeah. And so that's what I always look at, because I think the same thing. It's like, I have said so many things, I have done so many things that have had a negative impact. How could God ever use any of that? And I'm grateful for God's grace in that. But it also makes me cautious in the future to say, when I have a thought, what do I do with it? Just because I think it, does it mean it has to be spoken? And that's.
I got a boatload of notes on those. I figured if I speak it, I have a boatload of notes that may never see the light of day. Yeah. But yeah.
Maybe we need a journal of just all the stuff, that we think we want to say. Write it out and have a discipline of, I'm going to write it down and I'm going to give it 24 hours, or I'm going to give it a week, and I'm going to come back to it. And then as I look at it again with a different lens, and that's kind of what they were talking about in the video is, what perspective do you have? Do you have it from the perspective of God was present in the process of Israel's departure from Egypt, or God wasn't present in the process? As I'm writing these words down, was this something that God was giving me to speak, or was this something that my flesh was crying out? And what do I do with it? Yeah. I think that would prevent a whole lot of damage that's been done over the years.
Oh, but my notes. Okay, so that's not a plug, but Apple on with their new iOS system, you can hashtag your notes now. So, and then it has a search setup based on those hashtags. Mm-hmm. So just what you're saying, I want to go back from the very beginning, 400 some odd notes ago. Mm-hmm. And I want to go back through the notes, and one, like a scribble note, right? Like, what did I mean when I wrote that? What did I mean? So some of those notes, I guarantee you, are going to be just what you said. Good idea in my head. Wasn't really God thing, is more about what was going on, or spewing something out, which is going to have no context, no purpose, of which you can calmly delete, right? But if it is something that sets it, and something that I would modify, for instance, a statement that I have, I could type in something I think differently now, or at least hashtag it with the topic that it brings to mind. Then when I go back and I say, okay, now pull back all those things where I was thinking about this. Mm-hmm. Hashtag love, kind of deal. And then all of these, because love is going to talk on both sides of the fence, right?
Right.
That hashtag love is not all the lovey-dovey love letter stuff.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And so, and how you, to do that, to do just what you're saying, where we could go back through those 400 some odd notes that I have. Actually, I think it's like 483 going on 500 that I want to go through and do just for that reason. Let's clear out the junk. Maybe say something, said, "Ooh, I said that, didn't I?" You know, and I don't have the audience that I might even have shared it with. And so I have to give that to God. But that's and that's the repentance part. Hey, I did it. And only you can fix it. Nobody else can. When I had some suicidal thoughts a number of years ago, and I'll share that story sometime, because I probably should, especially after tossing it out like this, right? And I remember Mom and my ex at the time, Tree, were talking, and my mom told Tree, said, if Bobby is going to do this, it's going to be too late. You're not going to figure him out. It's not going to work. The only one that can get to him is God.
Yeah.
And the only one that got to me was God. And God said, don't do this. This is words. Don't do this. It's wrong. Then I sat in a cold car till the morning when it was safe to drive home, because in the middle of a Scotland bluster storm going on in the Highlands, I'm bumped with a bunch of cows at an ancient chapel that had been built in the 1700s. And you go, only God can redeem those moments. And I want to go back through my notes and look at those moments where I need to repent for, and look back and say, and because the audiences most likely are not here, but where you can go back and have those moments of, hey, you know, what do I do? You know?
Yeah. I think a lot of times we need to, in terms of what we're thinking, what we're feeling, some people are internal processors. Some people are external processors. My wife's more of an external. When she needs to think through something, she needs to talk it out loud, and I need to listen and, you know, just be a sounding board for her. When I process on the inside, and I need to just kind of let the gears run in there and then, you know, speak out, kind of thing. But in either case, there needs to be a balance of both, where we're thinking through, why am I thinking what I'm thinking? Why do I think I need to say what I feel like I need to say? And is it something that's going to be, I don't think we always need to say things that are happy and beneficial and, you know, wholesome and good and that. Sometimes we need to just kind of find somebody and say, I just need to let this out, you know, and you know, kind of like working out, you know, to get that aggression out.
Have those people in your life that you can do that with. Yeah.
Exactly. I tell the associates at work, because they get frustrated with customers, and I don't want them getting mad at the customer. So come back and talk to me, and just kind of blah at me, because I don't take it personal. And that keeps you from saying the wrong thing to the wrong person.
Yeah.
And that's what we need, those kinds of people, those kinds of relationships.
Yeah.
And then people who will then speak back truth to us and say, you know, hey, you know, I hear what you're saying and I understand the frustration. Maybe ask some questions about, you know, how is that, you know, is that something that, you know, Jesus would have responded in the same kind of context, or what is it that you think God is trying to do in you that, you know, he's shaping and, you know, culling off, you know, that might not be good.
Yeah. I used to do that tactically in soccer games in microcosms of time, talk about soccer as a microcosm of life. So to the point where you have these conflicts, and these two guys are going over, and there were times two guys are hollering at each other, and they realize it's not going to get anywhere. So next thing you know, I'm blowing a whistle in their faces and bringing them to me. And I say, okay, now you don't get to talk to me, you talk to me. You don't get to talk to me, you talk to me. We get it. And then we get to de-escalate it and manage it quickly. In those pieces that they're going to go, then you find out that the guy gets and da-da-da, and it wasn't what he thought, it wasn't what he thought kind of scenario, and he can de-escalate things, right?
Yeah.
And that's that's a snippet of a picture that looks like something, but what does that look like on the bigger picture? And what you bring out is much deeper on this, especially when you have those people that need to talk about those kind of things, where you go, that's soccer games in that level, that's elementary. Granted, different people are better at handling those situations, but I'm saying that's little. The things that we want to talk about are much bigger, and the scope is much more so. And how do we do that? And how do we do that? Being aware that what we want to share, they might not agree with, right? Or they might not take. And we're like, well, if you're not going to listen to my advice, then why do I want to talk to you? It's like, then why do I want to talk to you?
Yeah. I had a friend of mine, Matt, who's been a part of a couple of the different clubhouses that we've been on. I love whenever somebody says, I want to, challenge you on a topic, have a debate.
Yeah.
He'll always say, I'm happy to do it with you, as long as we both come to the table with the understanding that we're willing to admit that we might be wrong. Because if we don't come to the table that way, then there's no reason to talk, because it's just two people yelling at each other, and there's no benefit to that. But if we're willing to learn, and we're willing to grow, and we're willing to look inside and say, is there something that might be wrong in my perspective, then I'm willing to have that conversation. Yeah. And I think we need more of that. And you brought up a little bit ago the whole thing of there's the personal issue, then there's the collective issue. That we have a personal responsibility, but we have a corporate or communal responsibility in the way that we communicate. And we need to make sure that our words is not just because I think this is what I want to say, it's what is the impact it's going to have.
Right.
And is it going to be something, sometimes it needs to be, I was listening to Les Miserables today. I have an audiobook. I think I'm about 3/4 of the way into it. I think it was 60 some odd hours of listening for this book, because it's such a big book.
Yeah.
And I think I have 17 hours left. It is so good. It's so good.
Yeah.
And he was talking about the difference between a riot and an insurrection. And the difference being, one is a thought process. An insurrection, you're thinking about and doing something that is going to have an impact, versus a riot, which is just an all-out, not even thinking kind of thing.
Yeah, yeah.
And it's like what she was talking about in the video. It's our emotions. Riots tend to come from, and he said, riots come from the heart. Insurrections come from the head.
Right.
And that's really what we need to look at when we're, thinking about the things we want to say. Is are we going to speak something that's going to have power to make change that is positive, rather than destructive.
There you go. And that's, if you go back, it's like, because I've started to do this. When you go back and whatever Jesus talked about, whatever Yeshua said, he actually lived out every single thing he said. So in other words, you could go back to what he did, and what made the book, what made it in the books with the eyewitness accounts that we have with the Gospels and Acts, right? The part of things he actually did, like love your enemies. And you go, well, it's a great talk. And you go, well, actually, he gave a little example of which you're not comfortable with. His example of love your enemies, we don't like.
Right.
It's very emotional and it drives our deal, but we don't like it. And it's sorry, but that's his example in his kingdom with his his ideas. And a lot of what we have with him, what we do is we break those things down that he said and did. And that bothers us. And how we do that challenges us. And then our ability to share it and say, well, I think we do it this way. And I said, I think we do it that way. That's the same discussion that you're reading in Scripture. It's the same discussion they had. They did it this way. They did this way. And which way? And he says, whichever way you pick, because sometimes it was whichever way you pick. Love has to be at the center. Like you said, if you're going to say something, what is it? I'd say love has to be at the core. Always. Mm-hmm. And I think everything he said when he did it, everything he did was in love, even when dealing with his enemies. Mm-hmm. You know, even to the point where we have the one emotional event that we see that we would take as this grossly emotional event was when he goes in and cleans out the temple because they had set up money changers and things that had no business in this area. And he's like, this is his father's house.
Yeah.
I'm his son. And this won't be here, right? And those are the guys that he clears out. He said he disrupts business, right?
Yeah.
What's interesting is, and we never know this, do they come back the following week? I don't know if we assume that, okay, no more money changers ever showed up in the temple again. I don't think so. Meaning, I don't think that they never came back. I think they did. And I think that's part of what led to when he said, this place is coming down.
Yeah.
And there will be a stone not standing on it. And it was what the temple had become. And this is an interesting part. Now, take this for a chewer on a thought. We go, they'd gotten evil, so it needed to be torn down. Mm-hmm. Let me flip that and say, if this was one of God's representative places, he said, I can't leave it standing because this can't represent me anymore. There's a difference. It's that difference between like insurrection and riot. Right. You know, yes. There's a difference. And then he says, I can't leave it because it doesn't speak to me. It's not mine anymore. Right? It's been usurped. And I think in our communal, like we were just talking about, with the communal relation part, is that I think we think sometimes that we can say what we want to say individually and realize and not realize it has a corporate impact. Mm-hmm. That we are speaking for churchianity. You're speaking for your religion, okay? And i.e. you're speaking for your God. Mm-hmm. And we continue to smear God's name. And we have a big problem with that. Yeah. And so why do people want to listen to God? When you look at the mess today, I almost ask myself, why would you follow God? It's the honest truth. Yeah. Why would you follow God?
It's
scary. It's a scary thought.
In a couple of different contexts. Money changers in the temple back then, God says, I'm going to tear it down. Arguably, the Western church is very money focused as an institution, and God tore it down over this last year.
And you bring up that's a good uncomfortable discussion, and yes, and so now you're back to people just having to meet to study and talk. It's gonna cost a lot of pocketbooks for businessmen. Mm-hmm. But what does it do to affect the home church, hence the clubhouse room? But
well, and I'm not saying that the church, the body of Christ, is bad. No, that's right. God designed that.
Right.
But how we do it, and is it really functioning the way God intended it? Those are the questions I ask.
Yeah.
And I have to be careful because I'm not making a judgment statement here. I'm simply asking a question that we need to address and go back to and say, let's go back and look at what God's original intent was, and let's do our due diligence.
Yeah. And Rivke said, and when are we willing to be able to sit back and look back at some of these and go, are we sure that the position that I'm willing to entrench myself on, is that really what it is or should be? And you ask that question. The thing that I have with, because I'm not an end-timey guy, and I was, right? I was, right? And my Aunt Terry, if she's listening, is probably going, Bobby's a heretic now because he's not the end-timey guy anymore like he was, right? I was a late great Planet Earth, Hal Lindsey, it was all done. I never thought we were going to get out of Canoga Baptist. I thought, I'm never going to have kids. I'm never going to get anywhere. I'm not going to be adult, da-da-da. Grandkids, military career, life, da-da-da, over. But I also realize that in that's the generation has reached a point where God has said, my prayer now is, please, God, don't let this be my generation. In other words, I have the opposite prayer. Some people want that prayer that God comes tomorrow. And I'm like, stop.
No.
Stay there. I do not want you here now.
Yeah.
We're not done.
There's still work to do.
It's not right. We're not done. And I don't want to I don't. Because then we're in that part, and I don't want to be there yet. I don't. And again, it makes other people that the other side that is praying to be plucked off in a cloud and up to heaven, which is a whole other discussion we won't even get into. Any wrap-up thoughts? I did I mentioned this about glowing hyperlinks, people. So when you hear things in Scripture, and especially New Testament stuff, and you've taken the time to start reading the Bible and read your Old Testament, and you realize that sounds like this, or where Yeshua said things are going to go over, and then go look in your Schofields, and they'll have references where things point back to. But don't go back to the verse. Go back to the story that surrounds the verse. The verse merely tells you this, we're going to get the point. Read the story from both sides of it and get what's going on. So when they understood it, that whole story came along. It would go with reading a book. When you get to a point and they make a reference in book 6 in Harry Potter, you can't watch. And then when they make a reference to something, it brings you back to not just a line in book 3. It brings you back to book 3. Because of who it tells you, that character, those pieces, those events, those things that happened, and those kind of things. Same thing with this, is that we need to have a better thing on the glowing hyperlinks, people. So I highly suggest you do that. Anything closing for you?
It's something actually a friend of mine and I have been talking about recently, is just the power of words. I don't think it's coincidental that, John says, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God, that Jesus is called the Word. And I think words are so powerful and so important that I want all of my words to matter. I want them, I think I used the word with him, I want them to have verve and impact and not be so profuse that people stop listening.
Right.
And I want to think through everything that I say. And if we would do more thinking about what we say before we say it, I think they'll have more impact. And I think that's important when, we send off a quick text or an email or whatever,
right,
that we think through what is it. I love the discipline of Twitter because it makes you have to shorten what you say. And you can condense it down kind of like a good reduction sauce.
Right.
You boil out all the excess.
What is it? 200 characters, something like that?
120. Well, they've increased it. I think it's 240 now.
240.
It used to be 120.
Yeah, it used to be short.
240.
Okay.
But if that's all you have, I have a devotional that I do every morning, and it's limiting what you can type in there, and it makes me really think through what do I want to say that I want to remember. If we would think through more of the words that we speak, I think we're going to be better off for it. Yeah,
when we share something, and if you're sharing something and it continues to be false or fake or without impact, which is even a stronger word to you, Jimmy, that was good, that eventually it's going to be like Chicken Little and the sky's falling. Nobody's going to listen to you anymore.
Yep.
Nobody's going to listen to you anymore. And that's a fearful thing that I don't want to have where we get that. And I hope that these, along with the other Dusty Feet things, that cause people to ask questions, to enter dialogue. This just starts the discussion. It's like Clubhouse. Clubhouse just starts that discussion. Down the road, we were talking, we'd like to bring Carolyn on. Maybe the three of us can have on a red string. Because she, for instance, is the Democrat that loves Jesus, okay? And there's some of you that will blow your mind up, right? And the part of it is, I have come to love and respect Carolyn. And in that, I said, okay, what do we do to love, even if we don't agree with certain things? And how can I love you and let you do that? And the reason that I can say that, I don't say this, God does that to you. I hate to say it. God does that to you. And we have the audacity, being the people that we say we are, to turn around and not love somebody enough as ourself to do that. See, all of a sudden you're not even following the two commandments that you're doing. You're doing neither of them. You're not loving them as yourself, and you're not loving God with everything you are. So you can't, I'll argue, if you can't do those, can you really do the rest? Ooh, that's scary. Okay. Ooh, did I just, ouch. Because if you can't, if you're starting to hang your stuff on a mobile, and those two are hanging, and you cut those strings, the rest of the mobile doesn't exist. And I struggle to think that we need to go back to the beginning. That, like Genesis, I think Genesis is the top of the mobile. And if you go back to those two, that takes you back to the garden, which we talked about before. So, thanks again for being. And we'll have, like I said,
pleasure.
Yeah, we're not done talking about what we have too much fun talking about, right? So, there you go. So the videos that we talked about are on the Dusty Feet down there. This video will be on the website. I put it down below and get ready for the next live feed. The other series are up there. Please give them a listen. I think you'll enjoy. And updates, of course, on Twitter. Like we said, it just falls under other stuff. So next week, we're back to the homework series. This is part 2. It'll be part 2. We said before in the other one it went longer, but it is part 2 of episode 8, Jesus, Truth, and Spin. And we'll wrap that up because I want to finish up some good stuff and play some other clips from that video as we continue on the Matthew series. So I'll see you next week. Thanks for hanging with us tonight. I don't say it enough that I love y'all, and I should. So I love y'all, and we'll see you next time on the Dusty Feet.